My name is Andrew Moffitt. I am the Director of Speech and Debate Services, as well as the extemp coach for Lincoln Southwest High School in Nebraska. I have been asked by EIF to provide you a fun presentation on American power protection in the 21st century. So this is very much geared towards those U.S. foreign policy topics for our U.S. ex-competitors, as well as all international extemp questions related to the United States. So, when we look at the world of power projection, I think Waleed's presentation just a few minutes ago is a really good example of a very specific topic area where the United States has to be involved in the geopolitical game. America is unique among many countries around the world in the breadth and depth in which it can project its foreign policy and its influence around the world, specifically in an extent context. It allows for the United States' policies and abilities allow for it to bend the global space, oftentimes to its own whims. However, we have often accepted that America has had this foreign policy for the duration of its history. And one of the great things we'll talk about today is that America's power projection really is an invention of a more modern era than we would think. So, topics to be discussed today. I try to format like an extemp speech because that's the way I like working with things. First, we're going to look at America's late entry into geopolitics and establish a historical backing for why we have the tools and the strategies that we utilize to this day in terms of our power projection. Second, we're going to look at those contemporary methods of power projection, the breadth and depth of what the White House, what Congress, what the Department of Defense, and its various federal agencies can call to bear to influence America's position in the world. And then finally, considerations for extempers, things you can do both in research and in prep for a speech to answer power projection questions both effectively and convincingly, both for the structure of your speech and for that connection with the judge and the audience in the back of the room. So, as we go forward, please utilize the same approach as you did with Waleed. Put your hand up, use the hand up emoji, and I will be happy to answer questions as we get to them. So, we have to go back into the world of history, which for most extempers is one of our favorite topics, in order to discuss how the heck we got to this place and how the heck did we begin to develop the strategies that we utilize today to influence the world around us as a country. American power projection was not something that came with the creation of our country. In fact, it starts really at the end of the 19th century during what we would call the imperial era for global powers. So, for the first 120 years of America's history, we were considered very much a non-entity in the great power games of the world. Yes, we did interact with them from time to time. The Louisiana Purchase, the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire. There were times we interacted at a global level with these major players. That being said, the first 120 years of American history can be largely summed up with internal reconciliation and expansion. So, obviously, rationalizing and forming the system of government and rules that we have today, expanding internal territory, often to the benefit of some and the detriment of many others across the continent. And finally, reconciling deeper set issues within our society, issues such as slavery and states' rights for the Civil War. So, all of those internal things are a bit of a drag when it comes to like expanding your global influence. If you've got problems in your own house, you're not making friends on the outside very often. You're going to be very introverted. So we begin to recognize in the late 19th century that, hey, the rest of the world is moving on without us. It's time for us to put our foot down geopolitically. So at that time, the great power empires were in place. So we're looking at the British, we're looking at the French, the Russians, the Germans, even the Japanese to some extent, and the Chinese were beginning to either take additional land or playing their parts in this grand global geopolitical game, a game in which the US did not have a lot of chips in. So, in the 1890s and the early 1900s, we began to take some tentative steps towards flexing our global muscle and learning some important lessons along the way. One of the first examples of global power projection that the US undertakes is its tacit support of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893. Um, Hawaii was an independent country, but increasing American business and religious interests in the country were coming to a head with the elected government. When these business and religious interests decided to take significant action against the Hawaiian government and the Queen, the US provided both soft power support through diplomatic channels, but also provided hard power support through the deployment of American troops on Hawaiian soil to protect American interests in the region. This would be what we would consider kind of that first tentative step of we're not occupying a country, we're not taking it over, but we're going to help our America's interests along. So, 1893 sees the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom by American business and religious interests with the tacit support of the United States government. This takes another step 5 years later with the notion of the Spanish-American War. Now, debate still rages to this day. What happened to blow up the Maine and Havana Harbor? But, the obvious answer is probably some sort of mechanical malfunction. But the US government, seeing an opportunity to go empire building, invades Cuba and annexes the Philippines as a result of this conflict. Even though Spain at the time was a third-rate European power at best due to centuries of economic and political mismanagement, this was seen as the first major step for the US to challenge the global order, the status quo of empires. And as a result, it got a couple of cool territories out of it for a while. Cuba was occupied for several years, then turned over to a pro-American leadership. However, the Philippines were turned into an American protectorate, a status they would hold, including the time under occupation by the Japanese in World War II until 1946. That being said, this is also when the US began to seriously experience the bane of colonial empires during the time, which was uprisings by their own citizens. In this case, Philippine residents of the Philippines who had fought against the Spanish along with the Americans were made certain promises regarding their future status as a country and their autonomy following this conflict. Those promises were not kept. Therefore, from 1898 until 1903, we see a brutal guerrilla conflict take place in the Philippines known as the Philippine-American War. This results in the destruction of the Philippine insurgent movement and the complete control by the US of the nation, again until 1946, with a period of Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945. So we start off with a couple of little coups and a couple of little wars just to dip our toes in the water to say, hey, we can do this. We can do proof of concept. But we learned some lessons along the way. We learned that the notion of empire building is messy, that it is going to leave people behind and it will hurt people in the process. So we don't go doing any more major colonial expansion after the Spanish-American War. What we begin to see as a focus by presidents like Teddy Roosevelt is towards power projection and shows of force. And before the First World War, this culminates in what is known as the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was a flotilla of 16 battleships along with attendant vessels of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet that made a circumnavigation of the globe from 1907 to 1909, making port visits along the way. This expedition was done for a couple of reasons. First, it proved the concept of power projection that naval theorists in the US had been touting for decades. The ability to coal ships around the world, to visit places that had never been visited by an American warship before, was a major logistical hurdle for the United States Navy and the US government, and began to validate many of the concepts that would be later used by other power projection methods that we know today, such as carrier strike groups. And like Willie talked about, battle groups like the Seventh Fleet, which have proved vital for either diffusing or changing the course of serious historical issues in our society. But secondly, this was what we would call kind of a big flex at the time for American diplomacy around the world, because not only did the Great White Fleet comprise this military element, this military show of strength, but it also was utilized as a means of improving diplomacy with countries around the world. So, by showing the American flag, by sailing these ships, and by also incorporating diplomacy as part of this approach, the US was given a bit of a boost in terms of its global image at a time when still the major global empires like the British and the French still dominated the discourse of the world. So we see that America goes from nothing to doing okay in terms of its foreign policy within a very short period of time when it comes to power projection. But then we have what we would call a little bit of a wrinkle in the works come up. And the first of those is the First World War. Now, America power projection takes a bit of a hot and cold approach. We're basically the Katy Perry of countries for about 30 years. We utilize both our neutrality, our capitalism, and our production capabilities to influence global events at different portions from 1914 to 1945. Firstly, in both World War I and World War II, we attempt this dual approach of neutrality and capitalism as a means of power projection. We will not get dragged into another European war was the cry in 1914. It was the cry in 1939. But just because we wouldn't be dragged into war doesn't mean we weren't going to be selling anybody anything that we could to everybody who would be buying it. So we have this notion of economic of political and military neutrality until 1917 during World War I and 1941 for World War II. We stay out of the war. We do not send our troops into active combat as much as reasonably possible. Like during both of those times of neutrality, American troops do die due to accidents and due to unintentional enemy action. But what we also try to do is we balance this neutrality with economic trade. So we trade with the Entente powers during World War I, the French and the British and the Russians. And we do the same thing in World War II before we're dragged in with Lend-Lease. Because we recognize that one of the biggest ways we can project power at the time is through our economic base and our industrial base that is not being impacted by these wars. So, like Willie talked about, the US today has a bit of an ammunition problem. But at the time of World War I and World War II, we didn't have that. We were able to turn industrial capability not just to quickly rearming our forces, but also to exporting prodigious amounts of equipment and materiel to our nascent allies around the world. And we were able to take oftentimes those economic hits that came with it, particularly with Lend-Lease. Countries like France and Great Britain and the Soviet Union did not have the hard capital to truly pay for these purchases. So we gave it to them on credit. We said, hey, after the war is over, you can pay us then. That is a serious piece of economic power projection that we are able to basically give away stuff and say, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out later. And this is a theme that America continues to this day, and one we will definitely see both during the World Wars and after during the Cold War as well. However, even though America played the game fairly well in terms of its political and economic power projection, its military power projection suffered in both conflicts because, unlike today, where we have significant ability of power projection through the basing of troops and force multipliers like carrier strike groups around the world at any time, the US of World War I and World War II doesn't have that. The military is considerably smaller. It is considerably less well equipped. It is not prepared for this kind of power projection that is absolutely necessary. Hold on one second. Here we go. There we go. So we have to kind of rearm in a hurry in both of these conflicts. During World War I was particularly the worst, where we went from a military of maybe 50 to 60,000 active regular duty soldiers to one in the millions overnight. It's difficult to balance the needs of power projection when your army just doesn't exist. The same is true during World War II. but it was more structural then because enlistment was able to bring up numbers. The America's industrial base was able to improve their equipment capabilities compared to World War One. But the internal organization of the government was an issue that would plague the US in both conflicts, particularly inter-service rivalries between the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. This is something that American power projection has done pretty good about fixing in the subsequent decades, with something with acts like the Goldwater-Nichols Act that allow for better military cooperation, which improves the efficiency of power production overseas and in the US. So, we struggle to get off the ground in both conflicts, but as we see by the end of World War II, we have an army of several million that is well equipped, well trained, and able to execute the whims of the president, and in this case, their allies. But two conflicts in 30 years forces kind of a reassessment of America's ability to influence global events, particularly after World War II. Western Europe was devastated. Japan was devastated. The Soviet Union was a nascent and emerging threat to the global order at the time. So, under President Truman, we begin this realignment process of American power projection. We recognize that, hey, the US cannot sit in the back and only come in when things are really dire and fix things. So, America begins to take a more central role in foreign policy. One of the best examples of this is the Marshall Plan. Similar to Lend-Lease, where we just say, hey, have this stuff and don't worry about paying us. The Marshall Plan does this for the economic potential of the Western powers. Western Europe and Japan were devastated as a result of this war, of Second World War. The Marshall Plan pours the modern day equivalent of trillions of dollars into these countries, both through direct donation of equipment and economic assets, but also long-term loans and economic development initiatives as well. We rebuilt the German economy. We rebuilt, in many ways, the Japanese economy. We utilized the Marshall Plan to ensure that nations that have been devastated by conflicts, such as Greece and Italy, were rebuilt after the war. There was also a secondary reason for this. Hang on one second. Yeah, Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. That is absolutely correct. But we used the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine for another reason. We use it to check back Soviet expansion into Europe and into Asia as well. By donating massive amounts of economic aid, by utilizing this aid to benefit individuals who may be in a position of power to check back socialist or communist expansion, we were using the Marshall Plan both in terms of a diplomatic initiative to curry favor with those individuals who would push back against Soviet influence, but we'd also use it to ensure that economically people were not incentivized to believe socialist or communist ideas because, hey, America gave us all this cool stuff and I have a cool job and everything is awesome. So the Marshall Plan is both very selfless of the United States, but also has a massive underlying reason behind it, especially as America begins to realize that there are now two poles in this geopolitical world. There is the United States, and there is, in many ways, the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence. Secondly, is force projection. America did not project force militarily in the way that it does today prior to World War II. We recognize after the defeat of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Japanese Empire that, hey, we may need to put troops in places to prevent like people from getting too froggy in the future. So initially, these were the occupying forces in the various belligerent nations of the war. So U.S. troops in Germany, U.S. troops in Italy, U.S. troops in Japan. But also, we would begin to station troops in areas that we wish to see switch more over to our point of view politically and ideologically. So South Korea becomes one of these places and becomes a major flashpoint in 1950 with the Korean War. So we begin to permanently deploy troops around the world at a scale that we had not seen prior to either World War I or World War II. America begins to put its foot down. Additionally, not only do we take this lead in posturing our military, we posture diplomatically as well. The US is one of the founding members of the United Nations. It is the lead country behind NATO, much to the chagrin of our current president, who would like NATO to probably die a slow death. But we recognize that we, as a nation and as a power in the world, that we can't do this alone. We have to have people at least agree with us on the basic principles of what makes the world go around in order for America's foreign policy and America's power projection to work effectively. So we utilize organizations like the UN and NATO in order to not only push for our vision of the world in terms of foreign policy, but also as a means of standardizing global dialogue and discussion regarding a number of issues for both politically, economically, and militarily as well. But that doesn't mean we don't occasionally put our foot down and do things, as we would call it. We implement a number of military interventions during the Cold War in order to ensure our political and practical considerations are being met as a nation. So, ideologically, this could be the war in Korea, this could be the conflict in Vietnam, even the invasion of Grenada in 1983 is a good example of this to prevent socialist and communist infiltration in the Caribbean. We also take care of this for practical reasons as well. One of these examples is the invasion of Panama in 1989. This was to both punish Manuel Noriega for his various crimes, particularly against American service members in the country, but also for the practical consideration of ensuring America's access to the Panama Canal, which was a massive means of force projection for the United States because when it was built and then expanded in the early 2000s, these were had massive implications for American security policy because now we can project force quickly and in greater numbers than we ever could before by either sailing around South America or sailing around Africa. So even these kind of big mega projects that are very physical, very tangible, have impacts on this wider power projection because of their very existence. And then finally, and most sneakily, is the US begins to rationalize its power projection through its intelligence agencies. Prior to World War I and World War II, intelligence services in the United States were very disorganized, often did not work together, and did not often receive clear direction from either the executive or the legislative branch on their intentions. This changes after the Second World War with acts like the National Security Act of 1947, and that also create institutions like the US Air Force, which allowed for the creation of centralized intelligence bodies in the United States. So this would be the CIA, the NSA, and for domestic law enforcement, the continued rationalization and expansion of power of organizations like the FBI, which had existed prior to the war. All of these agencies, under federal direction, contribute to America's power projection, particularly organizations like the CIA, which have, a not great history when it comes to allowing for regime changes to happen, or often being the moving party behind regime changes in places like Iran in 1954 or in Chile in 1973, that furthered US interests to check back against its perceived ideological foes, in this case, socialist or communist ideology. So these intelligence agencies also become part of that power projection, often moving in the shadows, but allowing not only for their own operations to have an impact, but the intelligence information they gather to influence economic, political, and standard military applications of force projection and power projection during the Cold War as well. All right. Make sure we're good there. Fantastic. All right. Now we get to the fun time, the time, my lifetime in this case. 1991, the Soviet Union falls. Um, it's a bit of a shakeup, as one might say, but it does create this very short period of time where the US doesn't really have a near peer or a peer opponent in the world geopolitically. So, what happens when a massively centralized and efficient foreign policy and power projection system suddenly has nobody to go up against for a decade? It goes into what we call mission creep. It begins to disseminate itself into smaller and smaller packets around the world. And this is where see the issue of global policing, or as some very cynical people will call Pax Americana. The peace guaranteed by the Americans. It's a bit of a contradiction, unfortunately. As the 90s will show, America's power projection began to shift in a lot of different ways, especially in ways that became more and more public to the American people. And this resulted, unfortunately, in a lot of inconsistencies in how we approached conflicts around the world. So we have um, Rwanda in 1994. The US doesn't do a good job. We dropped the ball on power projection in this genocide. The Balkans in the mid 90s. America does better, but we still drop the ball in a lot of ways that lead to a lot of innocent people dying. And then we have these moments of actual success. The second Taiwan crisis, which Waleed talks about in in the previous lecture. The US uses a massive show of military force along with what we would call shuttle diplomacy between Taipei and Beijing in order to defuse the crisis. One of the major foreign policy wins of the Clinton administration. And then finally, we have the issue of international terrorism, which I think, unfortunately, we can say mixed bag of success during the 90s, leading to some really bad things in the 2000s. So America is having to re-find its footing here again in terms of its foreign policy. It's going from this single peer opponent, Russia, the Soviet Union, or like the Warsaw Pact, to now having to stamp out brush fires around the world that prop up with increasing regularity. America is not ready for this. But at the same time, we are beginning to scale back our physical projection around the world. This is due to two parts. First, it's money. If you don't have a Soviet Union to fight, why are you maintaining a defense budget like you want to fight the Soviet Union? The Clinton administration, being under significant pressure from the American populace to cut government spending and redirect it into programs at home, began to implement pretty drastic force reductions as a result of the end of the Cold War. This included the rapid withdrawal of forces from Germany, as well as phased withdrawals of forces from Japan and South Korea, as the perceived threat in those environments began to decrease. Additionally, America saw fit to reorient a lot of its foreign policy or a lot of its force projection due to what we would call other considerations. The first would be the Base Realignment and Closure Act's impacts in the 90s and early 2000s. As more American bases in the US were being slated for closure, political considerations often withdrew forces from overseas to restaff those bases, to keep those bases open, to support local economies. Um, you know, I live in the Midwest. I actually live in Nebraska. The nearest Army base for me is Fort Riley in Kansas. Fort Riley was considered for a time to be on the base realignment and closure list. However, the withdrawal of an entire infantry division from Germany back to the US in the 1990s, the 1st Infantry Division, saved that base from closure and really saved the region from a lot of economic downturns as well. But the whole reason it was there was because of congressional lobbying. So political considerations would often pull troops back to protect domestic bases at home, but also the actions of US forces in some of these countries led to significant pressure to draw down forces. This is especially true in places like Japan and South Korea. Okinawa has seen decades of civil protests against US military forces on the island. In the 1990s, those protests intensified massively because of the actions of US forces on the island. Like, they committed bad crimes. So the US had to begin to reorient its forces into other parts of the region, places like Guam, for instance, in order to help diffuse this potential diplomatic disaster with the government in Tokyo. The same is true with the South Koreans. Um, US forces in the country often were some of the loudest, drunkest US troops in service. and unfortunately, clashed very heavily with South Korea's newly democratic government over how criminal cases or how the conduct of U.S. troops could be handled. So the U.S. began to withdraw troops from the region or rebase them in different parts of the country away from major urban centers so that way bad things wouldn't happen because unfortunately, when you put a lot of people in a place they've never lived in before, bad stuff is inevitably going to happen. Like the statistics unfortunately exist. So, America is facing ever increasing brush fires around the world, but with fewer forces to try and tamp those out when a military response is required. This leads us to the 21st century. September 11th happens. I was in seventh grade. A lot of you guys, most of you guys, if not all of you, weren't even born yet. So this was when I became an extemper. I started competing in extemp in the fall of 2003, 4 months after the invasion of Iraq. It was really fun times. But after this event, we begin to shift our focus towards reasserting global dominance, specifically in the case of the post 9/11 world against the specter of international terror. So, what does this mean for power projection? It means we're back to an explosion in direct military intervention and presence worldwide. This doesn't mean we're putting thousands of troops in a country. Now, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, absolutely, we put hundreds of thousands of troops in those countries when we invaded both of them. But for countries around the world, they began to see a marked increase in US military presence and power projection as a result. This primarily came through small military deployments, special forces, military training missions that would often be utilized to help train local forces to deal with the specter of international terrorism. Some nations that often had these forces in them, so regions in like the Sahel, for instance, that often had French and American military advisors to train local forces against organizations like Al-Shabaab. Or Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines had to be combated by the Philippine Armed Forces, which were receiving significant U.S. training and resources post 9/11. There's also another reason for the US presence in the Philippines, which we'll get to in a second. So we see this explosion in kind of the direct military intervention that we utilize. So this necessitates an increase in the armed forces. Necessitates a heavy usage of National Guard and Reserve troops. And as a kid who was in junior ROTC in high school, like a lot of kids in my class joined the military during that time. So America was definitely ramping up military presence around the world. But we were also utilizing our diplomatic tools. So we had diplomatic scuffles at the time as well, especially with erstwhile allies like the French, who took a more nuanced approach to the war on terror and often saw America's heavy-handed approach as counterproductive, to say the least. But we also began to increase our diplomacy against these perceived threats with nations and actors that we often would not normally interact with. For instance, Bashar al-Assad in Syria was a good example of this. We traded intelligence and training with the Syrian government to help fight back against al-Qaeda and Iraqi-based insurgents. We engaged with countries like Pakistan, who have a not great history on human rights, in order to prevent additional threats against our flank in Afghanistan. We also began to work with, nations around the world who often didn't have the best records when it came to human rights, internal security, or even their tensions with their neighbors. This became a complicated era for American diplomacy, and one that was very reminiscent of the Cold War, where we would often work with unsavory regimes like apartheid South Africa in order to push back against communist influence in the newly post-colonial African continent. Um, I know way too much about that subject. That was my undergraduate thesis in college. Um, at the same time we were desegregating schools in America, we were enabling South African police to like go into black townships and like beat people up. So not great American foreign policy, I'll tell you that much. Mel, you got a question?
I just wanted to ask, I think this topic is really interesting. There's probably a lot more depth than you obviously can cover in like a 1 hour lecture. I was wondering, do you have any like books like any resources for us to learn more about this kind of like the Americans, like America's power with other nations, foreign policy, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I'll start you off with a kind of an easy out. So I always look to the book Africa Unchained as a really good example for like economic policy by the US or economic power projection by the US in the post-colonial era, and then alternatives that African nations can take to get out from under that. Let me see what else I've got here. I have a small list that I can pull up while I'm chatting with you here. Let's see. Um, I would also say like Jeffrey Sachs' book, A New Foreign Policy, is really good, especially if you're talking about a more critical approach to things like American exceptionalism, especially in global policy. That's not a bad book to read as well. Otherwise, if you're wanting to kind of talk about, maybe kind of as an addition to, say, the Asia topic that Waleed was talking about in his last lecture, Lost Decade, the US Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power is really good as well. Really talking about how our pivot to dealing with international terrorism and some of these other issues really stepped us away from other really more prevalent and potentially more fundamentally dangerous issues, especially if we're talking about like peer or near peer conflicts.
Sorry, what was the second book you said?
That was, let me pull up my list. Jeffrey Sachs, A New Foreign Policy. Um,
Great, thank you.
yep, not a problem. All right. So we see this increasing diplomatic complexity at a time when America really hadn't had to deal with that. America was the good guys during the 90s by their own perception. So we see that in the Bush and the Obama administrations, we start working with these less savory actors in order to get to our goals. But underneath the surface, we see this radical shift in global polarization happening at the same time. So this really breaks down into three key areas, especially when we're looking at this from an extemp mindset. First is that we see this emergence or reemergence of like India, the Russian Federation, and China as global powers. The world kind of quietly becomes a very multipolar place without us really knowing it, especially as Russia comes back into the forefront in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, when we see Narendra Modi's more aggressive external foreign policy begin to manifest in India, and then China under Xi Jinping trying to find this place in the world where it can have its own sphere of influence in places like the South China Sea, and as Woodley talked about in his lecture, its rather fractious relationship with what it calls its renegade province, Taiwan. Um, we're kind of unprepared for this in a lot of ways when it comes because one, our diplomatic and intelligence efforts have been faced towards global terrorism. But secondly, on the military level, we missed an entire modernization cycle because of the global war on terror. The military of the 2020s is the same state of readiness and technological capability as the military of the 70s after the Vietnam War. If we go to war with China, if we go into a near peer or peer level conflict, as Willie talks about, a lot of our stockpiles don't exist anymore because they've been given away to these other brushfire conflicts that the US has had an invested interest in, like the war in Ukraine. So America is getting kind of caught flat-footed by this emergence because now you have multiple poles of influence around the world, but also the current political administration making more multipolar powers hate us as well, like the European Union. Additionally, this brings up the notion. Oh, we have a question.
Yeah, I was gonna ask like, so basically, does this kind of crystallize the idea that that's like kind of been a repeated problem of the U.S. military, like the Cold War, they hyper fixated on communism, and then they couldn't like recover after the Soviet Union fell, and in a similar fashion, they hyper fixated on the war on terror, and then after pretty much that wasn't a concern anymore. Now we're also behind in that
Yep,
sense.
absolutely. And I think it's been made more starkly apparent by the war in Ukraine because we've seen this rapid escalation in technological innovation because of the conflict, particularly with drone combat, hypersonic missiles, um, but also this return to kind of like this World War I static warfare. So we are recognizing that, oh, we figured out how to like go after insurgencies and terrorists really well in 20 years. But now we're not prepared to actually go up against like a military that's like fully integrated and like has the power of a nation state behind it. So that's why we're seeing a lot of these deficiencies when it comes to readiness of both manpower and materiel, especially as we begin to pivot more towards the Indo-Pacific in the long term as kind of the primary place where we're going to see, peer or near peer conflict statistically happen. But secondly, not only are we watching this multipolar world develop, we're also seeing them working together, and often in alliances that don't conform with the ones that we put together after the Second World War. So, this growth of alternative coalitions to their Western counterparts. So, like BRICS and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations are two easy ones that come to mind. Are they in their infancy? Yes. Are they super on message with each other about a lot of things? Probably not. They have their their downfalls, their pitfalls. But these alternative coalitions coalesce political, diplomatic, and economic power away from the United States in places where it often can't influence. The BRICS coalition is a fantastic example of this. Brazil, we could probably talk to pretty well. Russia, we're absolutely not going to talk to unless it is like, please make peace with Ukraine. Thank you very much. And then India, China, and South Africa, we've variously upset them just in the space of the last 9 months. India is facing new sanctions because of its decisions, much to the chagrin of the Modi administration. China is just China, and they are really enjoying trolling the US at every turn right now. And then South Africa, we literally, ran a bunch of falsehoods out about white genocide at the start of the year, which tanked relations with that country. So the US's actions are kind of messing up our ability to resolve issues with these alternative coalitions or even just engage with them on a civil level. And then finally, we have an increasing number of rogue actors who can potentially cause us some problems in terms of our power projection. We have the classics. We have Iran and North Korea being two of the big ones. But Israel has now entered the picture in a big way. Often, one of our staunchest allies has now just gone completely off the rails since October 7th. And we're seeing now that there is a major disconnect between the American voting public and the American political establishment over what our approach to Israel should be because of its actions against the Palestinians and its actions and its antagonism towards Iran as well. So we have not only these major shifts in the political poles of the world, but we also have these new brush fires that tend to erupt out of nowhere and burn really hot, really fast, and that can hurt us in the long term. So into this environment, how can America step in with its power projection? We'll look at economic, diplomatic, and military. Economically, biggest things we talk about in the last 6 months in terms of US economics, especially if we're looking at outward, are tariffs and trade policy. America does not necessarily have state control over industries. It can exert a significant amount of influence over those industries in terms of funding, preference, and influence. But unlike countries such as the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation, state control of industry is often far less, which sometimes leads to a lot of nastiness, as Willie talked about, with like the military industrial complex and a lot of graft and corruption going on. But this is also a multi-layered approach as well. It's not just the national government that is often dictating this power projection on how we invest America's funding or how we direct our companies to potentially look to other places, but even individual states can have significant influence in this as well. I live in Nebraska, and my last full job before starting my company was with the Nebraska Department of Economic Development. We had trade missions that would go out literally every month to countries around the world to both solicit and to provide direct foreign investment into economies around the world. So, this is an approach that we often utilize in order to basically create redundancies for ourselves. So, if the federal policy fails, states can still have significant policy approach or significant power projection economically as well. It's awkward systems. Sometimes those are at odds with the federal government, but it increases exposure and image identification with economic systems around the world about how strong the US is and what the US can do to either benefit, or in the case of President Trump's tariff policies, harm the global economy. Diplomatic. Obviously, we often have to deal with the entire slate of federal agencies, the alphabet soup. Diplomatic efforts are multi-layered. It requires the State Department, it requires intelligence agencies, it often requires organizations like the DoD to get involved. We utilize this spectrum of diplomatic engagement from standard day-to-day talks and just presence in countries through embassies and consulates, all the way up to significant diplomatic issues such as expulsion of diplomats or tariffs or other tools that we can use to push diplomatic dialogue in one direction or another. A really good example of this is the recent efforts by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio to help diffuse tensions between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. This took a multi-layered approach. It took defense involvement, it took the State Department, it took intelligence agencies to come together to find a pathway for these nations to get out of conflict altogether. Hold on one second. Yes, and actually back to the NATO point. Yeah, typically typically EURCOM is what it's called, European Command. So like the head officer of NATO or his deputy is typically an American general officer. So like the US has a pretty strong influence when it comes to how NATO works both militarily as well as its interaction with the political components that also make up the alliance. Mel, you got a question?
With the fall of like US aid, as you probably know, what do you think are the implications of like the type of questions we might see next season? Now that, America has a lot of obviously like foreign policy influence. So
Mhm.
how do you think the questions are gonna maybe be a bit more framed, what topics we should be studying on, prepping for in that
So that's
sense?
a great question. So I think with terms like issues like USAID, if we're talking about the withdrawal of aid or the downturning of American, say, power projection, who's going to fill the vacuum is my first immediate question. Who's going to fill the vacuum? Secondly, how are they going to fill the vacuum? And finally, what are those implications going to look like? Is it going to be the EU? Is it going to be the Chinese? Is it going to be, say, like with security in West Africa, is it going to be the Russians? And what does that look like in the long term? Or if nobody does fill in the gap, what happens next? What are our implications there? So if it's USAID, like with a vaccination program, are we talking like new communicable disease outbreaks? Are we talking like new public health crises? Those are all back on the table again. So, in many ways, it redirects the actor who is going to resolve potentially these challenges that were being addressed initially by the US. Or with the lack of an actor, it now becomes how does the population being impacted either self-correct these issues or how these issues manifest into wider challenges. So, as for questions, I would be looking at probably more who's going to fill in for these steps. What nation is capable of filling in for public health prevention efforts in Africa, for instance. But also, what are those long-term impacts and implications? So a lot of these are going to be not necessarily persuasive questions in nature. They'll often be more informative in nature, just laying out the general situation. But I can see that, and I think we saw this to an extent at the end of this last semester, um, a lot more IX questions being directed to who's going to fill in the vacuum. All right. So additionally, for diplomatic side, as we know, it's massively multi-layered. It's both direct and indirect aid, direct diplomacy, indirect diplomacy, but also it still relies upon this permanent presence by the US in international organizations. So the UN, NATO, dozens of organizations around the world, the US has some form of membership in. So even if they don't have decision-making power within these bodies, they have the ability to use these as a source of information to keep an eye on the pulse of the world. And that is one way we look at power projection, is not just the projection of military power or consequences, but also the intake of information and the processing of that for our decisions as well. We have a question.
Yeah. So, in the context of international organizations and one of the LD questions this year, would you say like America's lack of membership in the ICC is a projection of its power or like a lack of power projection?
It's a projection of weakness, in my opinion, because it shows that one, the US doesn't want to play by the rules that it set up, especially when it comes to like, hey, we want the world to be safe, so we need to punish really bad people, except our people, because we don't want to deal with that. So it's a projection of weakness to some extent because it means that the US is not willing to be accountable to others. And I think that that accountability provides strength to a lot of other countries who have subscribed into the ICC or the ICJ, because it shows, hey, we're willing to work together in this sandbox. We're not just going to go throw a fit and kick our toys out whenever one of our generals gets in trouble for like war crimes or something. So I don't see it as a position of strength for the US to be on the outs in that organization. I think it's a liability for them and it opens them up to a lot of derision by the international community, especially as the US continues to support other nations that often aren't the greatest when it comes to their human rights records, like the state of Israel, for instance. All right, next question.
This is kind of similar to what the other two questions were, but I think given that the US is punishing other countries essentially with increasingly higher and higher tariffs, especially if you look at India, which is another democratic nation that the US previously sided with, and now Trump
Mhm.
is planning to double their tariff amount. How do you think that's going to impact America's foreign policy and their reach and global expansion in the future?
That's a really great question. I actually wrote a good question about that for this week's packet that's in the Discord. So, primarily, one of the biggest concerns first is if we're talking about economic output, India is still a massively untapped market for American economic power projection. So, losing that is a big L for us. But additionally, when it comes to military and diplomatic efforts, India is really well positioned for us in order to use as an ally or as a stepping stone to combat Chinese influence as well. India and China have a very acrimonious relationship. They've actually gone to war before over border disputes, and they usually get into like a big fist fight at the border every couple of years. But unfortunately, we're seeing that Modi and Xi Jinping are beginning to have like a better dialogue. So like relationship between the two countries is actually warming at a rate that hasn't happened ever since like both countries got their independence in like 1947 for India and 1949 for the PRC. So it's a bad opportunity because in order for the US to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, the Indo part is really darn important. And losing access to like Indian ports and Indian infrastructure in order to like base military assets at or to use as a follow-through point makes things a lot more difficult for the US and its allies in order to project power in the region. So for me, this is a serious blunder by the Trump administration. We need to, because Modi is a cranky leader and doesn't love the US for a lot of things. But he's one of those leaders we kind of need to keep on our side, at least enough that it doesn't wreck our power projection efforts. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next few weeks if like some DOD person who's doing the Indo-Pacific just suddenly resigns because it's like the government is like messing all this up and we're gonna blow everything up as a result. So yet to be seen how it plays out. Obviously, there's still a lot of posturing going on between Delhi and Washington, and the outcome of that is going to determine, do we actually go through with this, or is this just another massive game of political chicken?
Got it. Thank you so much. And
Yep, not.
going beyond the Indo-Pacific, if we look at like Latin America or numerous other countries that Donald Trump is pushing away due to
Mhm.
his specifically tariff policy and by cutting US aid as well, as Melinda mentioned, how do you think this is going to affect US's stage and presence in the international community?
It's going to start fracturing it, is what it's going to do. It's going to open opportunities for other countries to come in and exert greater influence and greater initiatives on the side of we're not the US. China has done this a lot with its economic development, especially in Latin America. Russia is doing this in West Africa with its security policy. We're already seeing these inroads being made, and we're seeing that the Trump administration is just not really grasping that this is a very complicated set of circumstances and y'all are just throwing sand in the gears right now. And that's a really bad thing that we'll look at, especially when we talk about like considerations for extempers. Um, see a couple questions. Let's go Lily first.
I just want to ask one more question
Of
about
course.
India. Considering their like whole strategic autonomy thing where they don't really want to align specifically like with one country, do you think it would be ever possible for the United States to actually like get India to wholeheartedly be on their side, assuming we change our foreign policy towards them?
No, never. Like this has been the enduring political quandary and economic like geopolitical quandary for like every major global power since the 1960s with India. Indira Gandhi started like this massive process of like this non-aligned movement where she said like, hey, we'll work with people, but we're not going to support you. So even the Soviet Union, who was the largest arms supplier to the Indians for decades, never really got more than a tentative foothold in the policy-making circles of the country. If the Soviet Union couldn't do that with all of its political and diplomatic output, the US is not going to do it either. India plays the game by virtue of working with everybody. It is the only way they have maintained, one of the few ways they've maintained their position as both a developing nation economically, but also as a geopolitical superpower as well. It's an odd place they're at, and they will never sell their souls to anybody because um, they are also a nation that was born out of colonialism. And they realized that, hey, when we hitch ourselves to one star, like the British, bad things tend to happen. So we're not going to do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, not a problem. All right, another question.
Oh yeah, I kind of wanted to piggyback a little bit on one of the previous questions. And so you mentioned that like essentially these tariffs and like the effects of them could potentially leave like room for other countries to have like influence and the enemies we're making, so to speak. So like I'm curious, like what would happen if other countries like didn't step in? Like what if we're just like in a unique position to provide such support? Like would you think that could like increase our power projection like by sort of forcing other nations to align with us? I mean, I think we're already seeing a little bit of this in the status quo with Trump's policies unfolding, and that like people are getting in line with us in order, like the whole Trump Zelensky argument. I don't know if I'm
Mhm.
articulating this quite well, but
I mean, I get where you're going though, like kind of our force of will more than anything else, kind of pushing other nations in the line. It's a lot less than it used to be. I'll definitely say that. I think that Trump has done a really good job at convincing people that, hey, the current American leadership is kind of trash when it comes to like following through on its promises. So, other than like, we're going to punish you, but like positive consequences, we're very bad at following through. So, when it comes to kind of, if the US is uniquely decided to solve this issue but wants to get allies behind it, I think we've burned a lot of that capital in the last 25 years. I think we see, especially with like the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where we gathered this kind of coalition of the willing. We also burned a lot of bridges politically in those countries as well, especially with like the government. We burned out New Labour in the UK over the issue of Iraq. Like that's why Tony Blair got basically kicked out of office, along with global economic woes. But we often become a bull in a china shop when we bring our allies along, they often have to step on the broken pottery at the same time. Nobody wants to do that. So I think that ability for the US by almost force of will to bring its allies along on a journey, if the US is like uniquely positioned to spearhead an effort, has become less prevalent in recent decades because of some of the blunders America's foreign policy and power projection have created as a result of misguided or short-sighted actions. And that brings us to the final way that we project power, which is by using the power of violence, or in this case, the American government's monopoly on state violence. We do this in a couple of ways. Here, let's get them all out here. There we go. Both military presence and direct intervention. We've touched a bit on military presence already. We put American troops in other countries, either to tamp down on potential conflicts or to serve as reassurance for our allies that we are there to protect them in case things happen. This also includes weapons of mass destruction. So America bases its tactical nuclear weapons on bases throughout Europe, even countries that have no intention of ever developing a nuclear weapons program. Like the Netherlands has American nuclear weapons on it. And we invite these nations into power sharing agreements where it's like, hey, if the big day ever happens, you get to use these bombs too. So we utilize the basing of forces both as this deterrent measure, but also this almost buddy-buddy measure where we say, hey, you can share a slice of America's nuclear power and America's power projection too, but you gotta let us have this air base. Thank you very much. But we also do shows of force. So sometimes it's not just enough for planes to sit on a runway or tanks to sit in their garages. We had to get them out. We had to flaunt them a little bit. So we utilize shows of force in order to highlight America's power and power projection. I think Waleed has a really great example with like the sailing of the Fleet through the Taiwan Strait during the Second Taiwan Crisis. We put an aircraft carrier battle group into harm's way. We just sail it through. If exercises like that are increasingly common in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, these are often known as freedom of navigation exercises. So we will sail a ship past Russian territorial waters or between China and Taiwan because by international law, we're allowed to do that. Even though it's a super antagonistic move, we're allowed to do that. So this is a bit of a game of chicken. Um, we also do this in order to de-escalate conflict as well. A really good example of this comes out of the 1970s. This was known as the Axe Murders. So in South Korea, in the demilitarized zone, American and South Korean troops were sent in to cut down a tree obstructing their line of sight with the North Korean border. At the time, North Korean, South Korean, and American troops could interact within the DMZ so long as they weren't armed. Um, However, that day, North Korean troops came up. They initiated a fist fight with the American and South Korean troops and eventually murdered two US officers using the axes they had brought in to cut down this tree. Normally, this would be like, America's going to war now, let's go. But President Ford decides that a show of force would be necessary. So he gathers up a massive display of American military firepower, two carrier battle groups, dozens of fighter jets, tens of thousands of troops on alert, puts them just on the horizon to North Korea, and then sends in a bunch of military engineers to finish cutting down the tree. So it scared the pants off the North Koreans, and they didn't escalate the conflict, and in fact would issue a very rare apology in later days. So we utilize these shows of force both as a reaffirmation of international law and in times of heightened crisis to overwhelm an opponent by the mere presence of forces to de-escalate a potential crisis. Finally, sometimes we have to pull triggers and the direct intervention has to take place. So we've touched a little bit on kind of unilateral and multilateral already and kind of how the US is beginning to lose that multilateral approach because of its actions in the last 20 years. But when we talk about direct intervention, it's not just send in everybody and go invade a country. I think as we've learned over the last 10 years, the US has a spectrum of options that it can select from in order to utilize direct intervention as a means of power projection. This could be the deployment of intelligence assets, special forces. This could be targeted and limited attacks on infrastructure, as we saw with recent attacks on Iranian nuclear infrastructure by the Trump administration. This could be the deployment of specific weapon systems to regions as a de-escalatory move or to protect our allies. So air defense assets, say for Israel during the first Gulf War would be a great example of that. So we have a massive spectrum of options. We don't just have to make war on everybody. we can selectively use military force across a range of options. And that's something that as extempers, we need to be cognizant about when we begin talking about how we talk about power projection in the speech. So how can we present this to a judge, to an audience, in a coherent way? First, when you're preparing for tournaments or when you are in prep for your speeches, think about history, do your research. If a big event is popping up the week of a tournament, find its historical analogs. Find out if we're repeating something from the past. Because we want to build a base of knowledge and a base of recognition for the judges in the back of the room, and an anchor point for you as a speaker to refer to before going to make more speculative decisions or more speculative analysis in your impact level. Secondly, be really specific with your examples. If we are talking military intervention, if we are talking political or economic intervention or power projection, be specific with your vocabulary, your nomenclature. Be specific with the scale and scope of particular policies that you wish to discuss as a part of your speech. Vagueness will kill you in these speeches, especially with experienced judges. But additionally, specificity benefits you with parent and community judges because it allows you to stay objective to your material. It allows you to show a depth of research. But additionally, it gives you opportunities to make comparisons between the specific subject and maybe something that's more general and that can be related to by the audience. Power projection is a vague concept. It's an ethereal concept at times, that it's often not well understood. Make it well understood to the audience. Give them those touch points. Give them those relationships or those guidelines that they can use to say, "Hey, I get this. I get what they're talking about. I get how this concept works," to at least the extent you need to answer your question convincingly. Finally, speculation and next steps, the crystal ball, as I call it. We are often called by our questions and by our speeches to engage in a little bit of hypothetical or future speculation. So we as individuals need to engage in that. So think about next logical steps. What's the next logical step if, say, we have a conflict? We'll use the Taiwan-China example as a good one. Let's say a Taiwanese fighter jet gets shot down on accident over the Straits of Taiwan, and the US decides to send in the Seventh Fleet as a show of force. What happens next? Use historical precedent, use academic analysis to find those potential pathways and work with the ones that are going to best support your answer in a convincing way. Finally, on the delivery side of the equation, because we don't all play on the national circuit, we have to deal with parent and community judges in the back of the room, and we have to spend the time to make this work. Pacing and pausing. Give your judges time to think about this stuff. If we're talking technical terms, if we're talking impact, slow it down. Give them the time they need to make those connections in their own mind. If you leave a judge with a bunch of loose threads on American power projection, they're going to go try and find their own solution to the questions that they have. And that type of intervention is bad both in debate and in extemp. So don't let a judge intervene for you. Secondly, impact, impact, impact. Whether it is policy ramifications or real world impacts, spend the time to impact out these policies into what will actually happen in the world should they go forward or whenever they are executed. So like your sea-level impact and your tie back to your thesis statement and your answer have to be really solid here. You know, find narratives, find quotes, find something that will get you that competitive edge. Because if you can quantify and qualify that impact, that's going to set you up for the best success. And then finally, a point for substructure. Look at theory and application as a combined aspect. If we're going to talk about geopolitical theory and what they could do, show me how that is done in the real world. Make sure they are connected and make sure that that connection is solid. So when you're looking at like your A and if you're doing like a three-level analysis, A, B, and C, if your A and B are sourcing, theory application, will be the best thing for you there at times, especially if it's a concept that is that is less common or one that's going to take a little bit more time to really unpackage. Spend that time doing it, and your judges will love you at the end of the day. So I get to now ask a question from you guys, one that I give to all my clients and all the people that I work with. Questions, comments, concerns, or snide remarks to finish out today. Mel, what do you got?
This is similar to what I asked Waleed, but it was about how do you think we're gonna see a bigger like future implications now that Trump's president, like what's the change? Like basically like past and like what's the future? Because Biden was obviously president, he had his own policies. Trump obviously has his own opinions about foreign policy. How do you think we're gonna see that change and how that could impact the type of questions we see, how we
Mhm.
impact just like extempy stuff?
Yeah, so good points all. So two ways. First, it's going to become more transactional. Second, it's going to become more antagonistic. First, on the transactional side, no nation is selfless. No nation is truly selfish. But we will definitely see a move by the Trump administration to be more selfish in its foreign policy, especially in terms of quid pro quo. If we're going to do something for other countries, we want something back in return, or at the very least, a change in the status quo that will potentially benefit the US in the long run. So, one of the big things with the Rwanda DRC peace framework is that there has been a lot of touted potential for a minerals deal between the Congo and the United States. Otherwise, like, what's the real reason, that we were going to get involved in that conflict? There wasn't a huge amount of one, other than the standard humanitarian concerns. So what we see there is that oftentimes, those more selfless issues that result in the U.S. intervening diplomatically, economically, or militarily with its power projection, those humanitarian aspects are often becoming less important or less powerful incentives for the government to intervene. And we've seen this too with conflicts across the world in the last 9 months, especially when it comes to how the US is supporting or not supporting specific regimes, like the Israelis, for instance. Secondly, it's going to get a lot more antagonistic. We've already seen this with trade policy throughout the world as well. We've seen this with Trump's relationship with NATO, especially in terms of the US's continued support of the alliance now being contingent upon increased European defense funding because, Trump just doesn't want to be. Trump basically said, if you can't pay your own way, we're going to get out. Like, we're not here to like work with people. And unfortunately, that's a mirror of domestic politics as well, especially when it comes to the cutting in federal programs that we've seen across a number of different fields, where this president is not going to give away something for free, and he's going to grouch about it when he has to. So that's obviously going to cause significant concerns when it comes to how America's foreign policy looks. And then in our questions, we're going to be looking at those impacts and those implications more. But on the IX side, it's going to be a lot more about how can nations work around these issues or kind of walk on eggshells a little bit to try and maintain some semblance of the status quo, at least until Trump gets voted out of office in 2028, one hopes. All right. Any other questions or concerns or comments? I'll even take a snide remark if you're really desperate. Yes.
Not a question, but I just want to say it was quite the informative lecture. It was very in depth, and I appreciated the interesting aspect it examined of our history.
hmm Unfortunately, we don't get often taught a lot of this, during our education process. The US has done some good things, but we've made some mistakes too. So it's important that both of those get considered when looking at how we can project power and how that projection is viewed by the rest of the world. Because, our hands aren't clean. Nobody's hands are clean in the global geopolitical space. That's just the fun of like Bismarckian realpolitik, is that everyone has to make unsavory decisions at the end of the day for their best interests.